In 2010, the UK had a record peacetime budget deficit. The incoming government sought to reduce debt through austerity, but over the next 13 years, debt to GDP has steadily increased and is forecast to keep rising, with a vague hope that it will fall in 4 years' time. Due to these deteriorating economic circumstances, the Labour Party have cut back on their green investment plans, saying we can't afford it. It's not just central government debt. Local councils are on the brink of bankruptcy, the high street is in crisis, and mortgage insolvencies are rising. But is it as bad as these negative headlines? And importantly, is there a way to break out of this doom loop of rising debt and falling growth? Unfortunately, the UK's fiscal situation is somewhat worse than it actually appears for 3 reasons. Firstly, the forecasts are based on entirely unrealistic assumptions of government spending. The government has assumed that tax revenues will rise with inflation, but government spending will not. The head of the OBR was scathing, stating that debt forecasts had to use government figures which had basically been plucked out of thin air. Worse than fiction is not something that offers too much reassurance. It means that whoever is the next government will need to implement deep spending cuts to meet these targets. And to achieve these kind of cuts would require deeper austerity than in the early 2010s. The problem is, though, that there's not much fat left to trim. Education has been hard hit, leading to crumbling schools and low teacher morale. The legal system has been underfunded, leading to a backlog of cases. Even the NHS, which has seen increases in real spending, is struggling to keep up with demand, as an ageing and sicker population places greater strain on services. One reason for the UK's poor economic growth is a record number of sick people unable to work. Recently, the ONS revised upwards the number long-term sick in the UK to 2.8 million. And this has a large economic cost we're seeing in lack of workers and need for immigration and low growth. The second reason to be really concerned about the UK's debt situation is that in the past 15 years, economic growth has slowed down dramatically. This means we've seen much slower growth in tax revenues than expected. But at the same time, there's been a growing demand for government spending on pensions, healthcare, and all the economic inactivity. If we ignore population growth, real GDP per capita is basically stagnating. Now, given all the pressures on government finances, the easiest thing to cut is public investment, because we don't notice that in the short term. And public investment has become much lower than in the post-war period. Under Conservative plans, it will fall to 1.1% of GDP. Under Labour's new plans, it will fall to an estimated 1.2%. So very little difference between the two main parties. The problem, though, is that the UK has had a long period of low investment. Private sector investment has fallen behind, especially since 2016. And the UK has one of the lowest rates of investment in the G7 and OECD. And it's this combination of low private and public investment that's a key factor behind the UK's low rates of economic growth. And also, this lack of investment stores up problems for the future. Potholes, congestion, lack of housing, waiting lists, poor health, all these damage the long-run potential of the economy. Now, in fairness, it has been a difficult global environment. Higher energy prices, slower productivity growth, Europe and China are both struggling. But it would be a mistake to say there's no alternative. The US economy, although far from perfect in many of its own problems, it does show that higher growth is possible. Since 2018, the US has clearly outperformed the UK and European economies. Whilst Germany and the UK pursue a form of austerity, the US took something of a gamble with a bold industrial policy, incentivising investment in green technology. It led to a surge in private sector investment in manufacturing. It's been quite expensive and has led to a significant US budget deficit, but also, by creating higher growth, it's led to higher tax revenues. And this is the real reason behind the UK's long-term rising debt. It's 15 years of economic growth below its post-war average, and it's caused tax revenues to fall behind the demand for government services. With low confidence and low investment, the economy has become stagnant. And whilst we think we can't afford investment in renewable energy, it's worth bearing in mind the cost of the recent energy price surges was a mouth-watering £280 billion. And this manifested itself in inflation and a cost of living crisis that affected everybody. This is why investment in insulation and renewable energy can have significant long-term benefits. So definitely there is a cost of investment, but also there's a cost of non-action too. Now the government's fiscal rule is to reduce debt to GDP over the long term. But the problem is that economists have very little faith in these fiscal rules. It encourages creative accounting and in the UK seems to cause cutting public sector investment, which is something the UK needs more of, not less. I would argue that the real reason for the UK's deteriorating debt situation is a lack of economic growth. And there's a real risk that the UK could start to emulate Italy. Italy's basically stopped growing since 2000. Despite frequent efforts to reduce its budget deficit, debt to GDP continues to grow, continues to inch upwards. It's the worst of both worlds, low growth and rising debt to GDP. So the best policy for any government would be to prioritise kickstarting economic growth. Ironically, Truss and Kwarteng had the right idea to try increase growth. They just went about it in a way that didn't work. Now, this also brings us to a third problem about the UK's fiscal situation, and that is rising interest rates. Since the return of inflation, bond yields have soared, massively increasing the cost of debt interest payments. Last year, the government paid nearly £120 billion on debt interest alone. When borrowing was cheap, the UK didn't take advantage to invest, and that's something of a missed opportunity. And that era, unfortunately, is probably over. Now, the future direction of interest rates is uncertain, with inflation forecast to fall, but also another complication. Under quantitative easing, the Bank of England bought nearly £900 billion of bonds, which made government borrowing cheaper and easier, because basically the bank were creating money to buy government debt. But now, all this is going into reverse. They are selling the bonds they own. They've already sold £150 billion, but there's still another £700 billion to go. And this quantitative tightening will push up interest rates and make it harder for any government to borrow in the future. And no one really knows the full impact of unwinding £700 billion of quantitative easing, and even whether the bank will be able to do it. But it will definitely make it harder for any future government, because it will relatively push up bond yields. Now, does this rise in interest rates and the market reaction to the mini budget of 2022 mean we should just give up and focus only on reducing debt? I think that would be a mistake for three reasons. Firstly, although the UK debt situation is deteriorating, it has been, believe it or not, much worse in the past. In the post-war period, the UK had debt over 200% of GDP, but we still invested in the NHS, education, building houses. Now, the reason such a high level of debt was not a problem is because, well, partly we had a big loan from America, but secondly, and perhaps most importantly, in the post-war period, economic growth was averaging 2.5% a year. And this is the real method to reduce debt to GDP, not austerity which reduces demand and investment, but consistent economic growth. Of course, easier said than done. And it is worth bearing in mind that economic growth can come from many sources. It could be private investment, new technology, a new burst of productivity. It doesn't have to come from a government green energy deal. But at the moment, hoping that something will turn up to change the UK's fortunes feels a bit too much like wishful thinking. Bold government investment can stimulate private enterprise too. At the moment, the private sector is lacking in confidence, perhaps because of frequent policy U-turns, costly changes in trade rules, and the general sense of malaise and weak wage growth. Now, arbitrary debt rules are really not helping. They're too easy to fudge, but also they fail to distinguish between borrowing, which can really help long-term economic growth and something that we need. Now, this doesn't mean the UK can magically improve all its public services through borrowing. If we want to tackle the long array of waiting lists through higher spending, we will need to push up taxes. If we want to have low taxes, if we want to cut taxes, we'll have to go private or put up with very long waiting lists. But if the economy is stuck in the doldrums, then there is some logic for a kind of fiscal intervention to help kickstart the economy. The goal will be to achieve something called escape velocity. This means escaping the cycle of high debt, low growth, low investment and low competence. When the economy escapes this doom loop of low growth and austerity, then the government starts to have a much better trade-off, and it can much more easily concentrate on reducing debt. Now, I googled escape velocity and realised I wrote about this in 2013, 10 years ago, and unfortunately we still haven't achieved it 10 years later. Do we want to wait another 10 years? Now, to achieve escape velocity, you do need some degree of boldness and not be hemmed in by artificial debt targets. Now, things might seem grim at the moment, but it could change for the better. Let's hope that they do. Now, another reason for broken living standards is a very real housing crisis. How did we end up with this situation of house prices and rents being so unaffordable? And what, if anything, can we do about it? This video goes into more detail, so do check it out. Thanks.